Welcome back to the Space Alvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
I'm good, Andrew. Really excited about this conversation today.
I am too. We have an interesting situation here where I am an American in Texas. You are an American in Poland, and we are speaking today with a Pole in Texas. So we have all of our bases covered here. And that guest is none other than Ewa Thompson, who is Professor Emerita of Slavic Studies at Rice University. Professor Thompson, welcome to the Space Alvi Institute podcast. How are you?
I'm fine. Pleased to be here.
Well, we're so happy that you're here, and we wanted to talk to you a little bit today about Poland and Western civilization, about this region of the world that you talk about as non-Germanic Central Europe, which is kind of a misunderstood and maybe even sometimes maligned place. I wonder if we could start with this really, really broad question. What is the significance of Poland in particular to Western civilization?
Am I supposed to answer this in one sentence, or are you giving me half an hour for this?
Well, maybe we'll just use that as a jumping off point. Maybe maybe we could back up to the history of it a little bit. There are these key moments in Western history where Poland has proved to be heroic, really, has kind of played a kind of savior role. And I wonder if that isn't appreciated enough. What do you think about that?
There are several such moments. And, there is this cynical saying that victors write history. And of course, that's the case. And I would say that Western Europeans have profited by the sacrifices that non-Germanic Central Europe has made for the sake of Western civilization. And then they wiped out the history of East Central Europe from their books. And when you get a book on European history, you basically get the book on Western European history. You simply don't hear anything about what I call the non-Germanic Central Europe, because if you did, maybe those European countries would not look as good as they do in most histories of Europe. So what I'm saying is that non-Germanic Central Europe, and Poland being the largest, most significant country, has been kind of place and I somehow I'm at loss for the right word. But let's call it, it was the buffer zone for Western Europeans a number of times in history. And Western Europeans used that buffer and thank very much and goodbye, and that was it. And the entire area was forgotten by historians and by people who actually shaped our understanding of Western civilization. So I can just go from the 20th century to the 19th and 18th and so forth, and just show you how in many ways Western Europe used Eastern Europe for its own security and its own advantage, and basically was only too delighted to call this territory of East Central Europe, non-Germanic Central Europe, as a sort of no man's land, a land without history, a land without stories to tell, a land without any interesting discoveries, important books, and so forth. So let us say try something in the 20th century, the solidarity in Poland. Now, of course, solidarity did not abolish communism single-handedly, but if it weren't for this enormous rising wave of opposition to communism, probably the fall of the Soviet Union would not have happened when it did happen. Probably the Soviets would still last for another generation or so, or maybe even longer. What made the Soviets frightened was, of course, that this solidarity movement became a huge movement. 10 million people belonged to it. And it started in August of 1980. And by December, it had 10 million people. It's just unbelievable. So this is the sort of thing that frightened the Soviets and that very much embarrassed Western Europeans. I still remember the television shows in which some German politicians talk to Russian politicians about what are we going to do with solidarity. Now, this was basically the attitude on the surface, but deep inside, Western Europe was very much afraid that there would be some upheaval, that boat would be rocking, and that the good life that they have enjoyed, thanks to this buffer zone in Eastern Europe, will somehow disappear. So what I am really trying to say is that that without solidarity, events would not have gone the way they did in Eastern Europe. Communists would not have fallen, and basically the countries of that area would not have regained freedom. Of course, nobody is really interested in those countries, meaning that Western Europeans would even prefer that this territory remained in Russian hands because, well, again, a buffer zone, and we could have lived like that forever. But I would say that when it comes to Western civilization and Western Christianity, if it weren't for this Polish solidarity, if it weren't then for the expression of real loyalty to Catholicism, which Poles displayed at that time, things might have been even worse for Christianity and ultimately for Western Europe. But this is really a very short and incomplete story of what happened in the 1980s in Europe. But let us just go back, to the early 20th century and speak about something that really literally nobody in the Western world remembers. Or rather, I'm talking about historians. If you take a history of Europe, 20th century history of Europe, prominent historians don't even mention that. And that is the Polish-Soviet War in 1919, 1920. What happened then, after the Treaty of Versailles, independence of countries of Central Europe was finally established. And however, the Treaty of Versailles did not decisively speak about the eastern border of Poland. So what happened was a war started between the Soviet Union that was just about beginning to take shape and Poland. Now, Poland at that point had absolutely no money, no way of organizing the army. It didn't even collect the first round of taxes, and it had to fight this enormous, big, huge Soviet Union. And isn't that incredible that they won? They won even though the armies of Marshal Tukhachevsky, the Soviet marshal, were very close to Warsaw, and people were very pessimistic that the force was going to fall. And what's going to happen next was that Germany will be taken over by the communists, because in Germany at that time there was this enormous mega inflation. There were communists that were very popular, people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And Germany was ripe for communist rule at that time. Same in Hungary. In Hungary, Bela Kun, who was a communist and was about to form the government. So if Poland fell in this war, if Poland fell into Soviet hands at that time, Germany and Austria, Germany and Hungary would probably follow. And then, of course, the entire Europe. So Poland, by winning this war in 1919, 1920, saved Western Europe. There's no doubt about it. Saved it from the communist takeover. And when it comes to Christianity, of course, you understand what a Soviet takeover means for Christianity, and especially if at that time the entire Europe, or most of it, would have been taken over by the Russians. So we have here an example of a situation where one country really saves the entire continent and then is not even mentioned in the histories of this continent. I'm thinking, for instance, of Paul Johnson's History of Modern Europe. I was looking at the index. There is no such thing as the 1919-1920 war. It just didn't happen. It was so, Poles were doing something, but it's unclear what, and who cares anyway. So, this very respected historian simply didn't consider it important to mention that this imminent takeover of Europe by the communists was really not a joke. They said, well, it happened, and then Western Europeans had the freedom to live for another generation. And of course, in Germany, you got something that was not in the Western European tradition, namely Hitler, but that's another story. Still, the fact remains that Poland was not recognized as a country, as a community that saved Western Europe from a takeover. And then if we go back in history, we'll find, of course, the very famous act of the Polish king Jan Sobieski in 1683, when the Ottomans, another empire that was threatening Europe from the south, when the Ottomans were about to take Vienna, and when Emperor Leopold I sent letters to his fellow kings and rulers all over Europe saying, help, help, help. And the only country that responded was Poland. And actually, it was Polish king Jan Sobieski who decided to help the Austrian emperor to defend Vienna and to basically push the Turks away from Austria. Now, it was not in Poland's interest to do it. And I'll tell you why. It was not even in Catholicism's interest to do it. Because if Sobieski didn't do it, Vienna would have fallen. Vienna would have fallen, and the entire Western Europe suddenly would have to fight a war of survival because the Ottomans would go further. So if that happened, at the same time, Poland would have grown in strength and prestige and could have converted to Catholicism the eastern territories of Belarus and Ukraine. And we know that Catholicism resists communism better than Eastern Orthodoxy. So the entire Europe could have been Christianized in the Western in the Western Church, whereas countries like England and France and Germany might not have had the energy after fighting the Ottomans to do what they did, namely colonize both Europe and other areas in the world. So it would have been better for Poland politically, and even I would argue from the point of view of the survival of Christianity in Europe, if Poland did not help Leopold. But what happened? Poland did, and you know what? The Austrians didn't even pay Poland the cost of bringing this enormous army to Austria. Poland got nothing for it, not even a recognition in Austrian history books. There's one little tablet somewhere in the streets, among the streets of Vienna, saying, here, Jan Sobieski was here, but nothing else. This was Austrian gratitude for Polish help. Of course, the word gratitude doesn't exist in politics, so I apologize for using it. But what actually is the sort of laughter of history is the fact that 100 years later, a descendant of Leopold I participated in the partitions of Poland, got a chunk of Poland twice. Maria Theresa, that was in 1772 once, and then 1795 the second time. So, that was Austria's quote unquote gratitude for what Poland did. So again, you can say, oh, well, my speculation here that it would have been better for Europe and Christianity if Poland didn't help Austria. That's just speculation. But the fact is that by going to the help of Leopold, Jan Sobieski basically saved Western Europe from another enormous war with the Ottomans. Ottomans were an enormous, very powerful empire, and it was the time when they still could take over Europe. Well, they didn't, and as we know, history went the other way. And I could just go back now to the Middle Ages and speak of my favorite Polish lawyer named Paweł Wojtkiewicz, who was the first person in Europe to speak about the rights of nations and the rights of peoples, regardless of whether they were Christianized or not. You see, there was this group of people named the Teutonic Knights who left Jerusalem after the Crusades and decided they are going to do the quote unquote conversions in Europe. And they actually went to the Baltic Sea and killed and robbed and destroyed, and they called it conversion to Christianity. Now, a Polish lawyer had the documentation in hundreds of cases, and he went to the Council of Constance in 1414 and tried to present that documentation and proposed to the Pope that the order of Teutonic Knights be dissolved as heretical. Well, it didn't work out. The Pope himself was German. The whole assembly was dominated by ethnic Germans, and this Polish lawyer simply didn't have the guts. Didn't have, well, not the guts. He did have that, but but he didn't have the majority, to accomplish something. The Pope did actually upbraid the Teutonic Knights, but he didn't declare them heretics. And so the behavior that Paweł Włodkowicz called heresia prussiana, the Prussian heresy, simply went on in history. And as you know, in the early 16th century, the Teutonic Knights order dissolved itself, and the Grand Master of the order became a prince, and he claimed the property on the Baltic Sea. At that time, he was still a vassal of the Polish king, but later on, out of this, there appeared the country of Prussia, which Chesterton called the bastard country of Europe, because it was not supposed to appear there, the bastard country of Europe. And then, of course, Prussia participated in the partitions of Poland. So it basically worked to destroy Catholicism in Poland. In Bismarck's time, Polish children were beaten for saying their prayers in Polish. There's a very famous case in the town of Brzeźnia. Actually, this happens 3 years after Bismarck died, but it was still the same policy. Children at school, at that time, children did pray in school. So the children were told, to say their prayers, and they did. And they were saying them in Polish. And then, of course, the teacher decided that this is not acceptable. And every child that said the prayer in Polish was beaten. So that was, if you beat kids that are 7 or 8 years old, they're never going to repeat the mistake of saying those prayers in Polish. But they didn't know German. I mean, Prussia took over the Polish territory, and then little by little, generation after generation, they Germanized it. There's an enormous amount of Germans today that are of Polish origin, but this is still another story. So you see, these are just the hot points of Central European history. And I believe that if it weren't for some of those hot points, Europe's history might have been much less favorable for Western Europeans than it has been. But what I'm saying here is an incredible abbreviation of what needs to be said about it. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot of misjudgments that are being passed on this territory. There's a lot of suggestion that this was sort of an uncouth, uneducated, primitive kind of territory. Well, the universities in Prague and Krakow, where you are, were created more or less at the same time at the University of Vienna. In fact, the university in Prague preceded the creation of the University of Vienna. So, there's an attempt to say that these are peoples, these are territories where people didn't really have any contact with Western civilization is simply nonsense. In Poland, Catholicism probably survived better than in any other country except for Ireland, but we know what's going on in Ireland now. And in Poland today, you still have quite a strong streak of Catholic thought, but under the present government in particular, there's a vigorous attempt at secularization, and the fight is really, this is a fight for survival for Catholicism. I think not just in Poland but in other places, because if the present government succeeds in secularizing, say, the education, there will be massive changes in the Polish psyche. I personally don't think that will happen, because Poland went through communism and secularization of education already. But it depends on the Polish elites, Catholic elites, and Polish clergy. They have to get to work right now. They have to start using those big halls that they built in times of communism, to have to use them for education of children, not just in about matters religious, but also matters of history. This was something that went on under communism, and maybe we have to return to it right now. But this is something that still needs to be sorted out. Basically, the situation right now is that Poland has done all these things in the past, and right now is in a rather precarious situation, because its traditions, its very strong adherences to Christianity and Western culture. By Western culture, I mean the culture that is based on Greek thought, Roman law, and of course Christian belief. These foundations are being attacked by people who believe that Europe should be secular to the point where there's absolutely no mention of the transcendent, of the holy, and that's the way for humanity to go.
Yeah. No, the threat now of taking away religious education in the schools, and also I just saw that the proposal is to get rid of studying the history of the Battle of Grunwald, and to even get into many of those other particularly conflicts with Germany, or just perhaps being eliminated. But I'm thinking of somebody who knew well the history of Poland, but also particularly the Polish literature, which is so connected to that history, John Paul II. And John Paul II, many people at least in the United States, and I'm sure places also outside of Poland, are not really familiar with Polish literature and how that shaped John Paul II's way of thinking, even in particular in the way that he took on communism and took on secularization. Do you see like the need to delve into John Paul II, his Polish background, and if so, like who are some of the major Polish writers and translations maybe that should be worked on right now?
Well, I would say this: if you read Polish literature, if you're familiar with this, it's guaranteed that you'll become or remain a Catholic. This is a literature so permeated with a Catholic vision of the world that it's almost frightening. There's hardly anything there that is not telling you become a Catholic, be a Catholic, remain a Catholic. Even though the writers often, fail, they're not very good Catholics. So how does it work? Well, I don't know from which end should I start, the beginning or the end, that is 22nd century. But let me mention the Renaissance poetry, which is really a great poetry, totally unknown in the West. There are translations, but those things are not published, in such a way that it's easy to reach reach them. You have to go through anthologies, you have to go through books that are about other things. And then, by the way, there's this poet Kochanowski who wrote great things. Well, yes, there was one. And one of the greatest poets, certainly in the 16th century, was Jan Kochanowski. And he wrote poetry, some prose, and his poetry is so permeated with the understanding that the world belongs to God, and that we as beneficiaries of it should be constantly grateful to God. It's so beautifully expressed in verse, like czego chcesz od nas, Panie, za te hojne dary, if you remember that particular poem. What do you want, Lord, for these gifts enormous gifts that you are giving us? This is the poet that should be translated and read. Then there's another poet named Sam Sarzyński who writes about death and about things that are final in human life. Again, an extremely good poet, and he wrote a lot of sonnets, like Shakespeare, right? So those sonnets are really quite worthwhile to know. And by the way, Kochanowski also wrote a cycle of poems after the death of his daughter. It's the first case in Europe and probably in the world where a poet writes about a member of his family who died and sort of laments in those poems the death and describes the girl that died. Ursula, the Kochanowski's daughter, was something like 6 or 7 years old when she died, and he describes her in most beautiful terms, and he tries to come to some kind of closure after her death, but it doesn't quite work out. So he writes some more poems. So the 16th century. Then there's 17th century, full of very interesting works. And you know what? One of the reasons that Polish literature is unknown in the 16th, 17th century especially, and 18th even, is that a lot of it is written in Latin. This is something that you first have to translate it into Polish, for people to then translate it from Polish into English. This lawyer, Polish lawyer and bishop also, that I mentioned before, Paweł Włodkowicz, wrote his treatises in Latin. And just recently, Theologia Polityczna in Warsaw published his treatises in English, translated from Latin. So, there's this difficulty, which also tells you how deeply steeped in Catholic traditions Poland was, because just ordinary people could read Latin, just unbelievable to us. But they did. It was not just for the clergy, it was for ordinary folk. And these writings in Latin are really a stumbling block for many in Poland. For instance, there was a very interesting political scientist in the 17th century named Fredro, and he wrote his works in Latin. And he's totally unknown even in Poland, which I think is a great shame. Why is he unknown? Because, after the 17th century came 18th century partitions of Poland. People didn't publish Polish books. People didn't they fought for Poland, or they surrendered to the new power. But all those works that needed to be translated from Latin into Polish were not. So just recently, somebody in Warsaw translated Fredro's, Jan Maximilian Fredro's treatises, political treatises, into Polish, 3 volumes. I have all 3, and you have the Latin on one side, the Polish on the other side. Now, who on earth will read such a thing, in the broad world? They don't know Polish, they don't know Latin, and yet this is a very interesting. He's a very interesting thinker, because this liberum veto, which has a terrible reputation in Poland, I don't know whether you know what that is. It was the right of anybody to break up the deliberations of the Sejm, of the parliament, if he so chose, and of course that led to corruption and so forth. But Jan Maximilian Fredro defends this, and he points out that the goal of the liberum veto is completely different from what is being said, that it's encourages corruption. The goal is to make sure that the stupid crowd will not decide about the fate of something that's important, and a few wise men would be able to stop this kind of going towards the precipice. So it's interesting to read his argument, along these lines. So 17th century, is untranslated from Latin into Polish, let alone into English. And then you get the partitions of Poland, and then you have, of course, the Romantic geniuses, Adam Mickiewicz, Cyprian Kamil Norwid, Juliusz Słowacki, and Krasiński, four great poets and writers that are absolutely probably the best poets in the Romantic period in the entire Europe. Mickiewicz's Pantadeusz has been translated into English several times. The old translations are not very good, but there are two new translations that appeared within the last 20 years. One of them translated by I forget his first name. His last name is Johnson, who was my colleague in Indiana when I was teaching there. Excellent translation. It's a rhyme translation. And then there's another translation, which is a prose translation by Christopher Zakrzewski, a Canadian of Polish background. And when I was editor of Sarmatian Review, I published this translation chapter by chapter, because the Pantadeusz consists of 12 chapters. And so it's there, but also published as a volume. And I warmly recommend both translations. I cannot tell you which one is better, because one of them is prose, the other one is poetry, but they're great, both of them, really tremendous. And if you read that, you realize, my gosh, this man had an enormous, huge imagination, and what he describes is extremely important. And without, it's really a book that opens up Central Europe to you, I think. The poem of Pantadeusz. It's really a novel-length poem, which also makes you think, how did this guy manage to write it in rhymes, verse, and make it really interesting, not something like the 17th century epic poems that nobody reads because they're so boring. But Pantadeusz is not boring at all. So then if you go to poets like Norwid, extremely subtle, extremely philosophical, 100% Catholic, is unbelievably strongly Catholic. Norwid died of poverty, actually, in Paris. He died in an old folks' home run by the Polish sisters. And he was in the United States for a while, spent some time in New York working. He was a sculptor also. And his short poems are exquisite. I mean, they better than Keats. In some ways, I think they resemble Keats's poems, but Keats is writing from the very comfortable situation in his life. Norwid is always writing from the situation of a man who stands at the edge of a precipice, and somebody can push him in. So great poet. Then Słowacki, anybody that's Polish and read Słowacki as a teenager will never forget it. So I'm demonstrating that Słowacki poems. He also wrote long poems like Mickiewicz, Pantadeusz, but they're not as good. They're part of it. They're good, and not the entire poem. I'm thinking of a long poem titled Beniowski. Beniowski is a last name, and it's about a certain man who was named Beniowski and lived in Podole, which is today's Ukraine. And then Krasiński, which is really a story of its own, because he came from an aristocratic family and was pretty rich. Those other people were poor. And Krasiński wrote a play entitled Undivine Comedy, from which Dostoevsky stole almost an entire part of the plot and the idea. I very strongly recommend reading that play, because it's a great play. It shows the fight between the old system that is corrupt, that is full of things that should be removed from society. But it has something in it that's genuine, that's true, that's important, that's crucial to humanity. And the new system, those who went against the Bastille, who killed who executed the king, who executed others in large numbers, and which side is going to win? And of course, we know which side won, and but the play is so powerful that it's really, again, worth staging it. It's one of those romantic plays like Goethe's Faust, that has a lot of spirits flying around, so it's very hard to stage. But at the same time, it's very, very powerful and I think successful. So, these are the romantic poets. And then as you go through the 19th century, Poland has tremendous set of novelists there, two of whom got Nobel Prizes, by the way. One of them, Sienkiewicz, for the book Quo Vadis, and another one, Raymond, for the book The Peasants. But I like what a Polish poet, Czerniawski, who lives in London, said about another novelist, Bolesław Prus. Bolesław Prus wrote a novel titled The Doll, Lalka. And this novel, Czerniawski noted, would have been better known than Madame Bovary, Flaubert's Madame Bovary, if Poland were a big power like France. But since Poland was nothing in the 19th century, nobody read that novel, nobody translated it. It's a very good novel, extremely perceptive, extremely well reflecting the changes of the agricultural world into a capitalist world, and it shows what much of the 19th century was all about. Very, very good novel. Just translated into English, but again, there's no big push for the novel to be read and discussed. And again, I have to say, you have this rule that history is written by winners, and Poland certainly was not a winner and has not been a winner so far. So all those things are forgotten. And then you get the 20th century, again, poets, and a great poet named Zbigniew Herbert, whom I had the pleasure of knowing, and he was put up for Nobel Prize, but political considerations prevailed, and Czesław Miłosz got the prize. So he's a great poet and translated into English, and he has his own circle of admirers in America, and they're not Polish. They're really, his poetry translates relatively well because it's sort of dry and not dependent on some kind of flowery associations of words. So he's a good person to translate, and actually his complete works were recently published. I forget now by whom, but edited by Adam Zagajewski, another Polish poet. So you have a lot of literature, and I'm just touching here heads of some of the people that are in this group of great writers, and of course one can speak about that forever.
Yeah, and excuse me, Professor Thompson, sticking with this for just a couple more minutes. It does seem, even though we don't, in the United States and maybe in other parts of Western Europe, we don't know all of this, the richness of this Polish literary tradition. But as Bobby said in his remarks before you walked us through the centuries, in a sense, the victory of this Polish tradition is the election of John Paul II, and that we had this man formed by this tradition who was put in this extraordinary role. But the problem is we tend to think of him as this sort of universal figure rather than this man who was shaped by this great tradition that you're telling us about. And one more question then, I guess, and you can speak more to John Paul II too, if you'd like. But you touched on this a little bit. I'm not sure that very many of our listeners will have ever heard of this Sarmatism, and I admit I really hadn't heard of it. And but I'm beginning to be fascinated by it. As I sort of dig into it a little bit. What is it, and what is its significance?
This is the most difficult question that you could ask me. I
Okay.
wrote an entitled Sarmatism or the Secrets of Polish Essentialism. And it's available on the web. It was published in a volume, Being Poland, by University of Toronto Press a couple of years ago. And I try to answer that question, in this article. And I don't know if I can possibly even give you any good idea, but I'll try. 17th century was the time when Sobieski went to Vienna with his army. It was the time when Poland thought well of itself. Poland was the largest country in Europe. It was still this way. Also, yeah, but by the time Sobieski died, things were being destroyed. But people in Poland were strongly Catholic. They were looking at the world through the glasses that were created by centuries and centuries of Catholic thought and Catholic way of philosophizing, because when it comes to philosophy, there's only one way to philosophize, in my opinion, and that is the one that stems from Greek logic. 2 + 2 must always equal 4. If you abandon that rule, if you don't pay attention to this, you're eventually, you'll go into places where nothing makes any sense. And this is basically what happened to philosophy, European philosophy, in 19th century and 20th century. But anyway, this 17th century Polish nobleman, because we're really talking about the 10% of the population that was nobility, which was pretty large by European standards. Usually in Europe there are 1-2% nobility and the rest peasants and city dwellers. But in Poland, the nobility was a large group. So if you take the 10% of this Polish nobility, basically these were the people educated in Jesuit schools or other religious Catholic schools. These were the people that had a piece of ground somewhere, like hobbits. And these were the people that were ready to defend the civilization that they belonged to, which to them seemed only natural. This is the way to be, and this is the way to look at the world. And the Sarmatism meant that I believe in God, and of course this is a Catholic God that I believe in. I try to let others live and hope that they will allow me to live. Fatal rule, because this is what Paul thought, that if they don't do harm to others, others will allow them to live. No, it wasn't so. So, live and let live. I live in the best country in the world. I can read, I can write, I can go to the meetings of the Sejm, that is the legislative branch of government, and nothing in this country can be done unless we, the nobility, agree to it by voting for it in the Sejm. That's a very important part of Sarmatism. It means republicanism. It means that you have to, you feel that the normal way for a country to exist is to have the representative body, and that representative body is elected by the people, and no law can be introduced without the agreement of this representative body. This is a very important part of Polish history, and this is why Poles always fight for liberty, because liberty to them is like air that they breathe. They must have it. Without it, you cannot live. So you have this mixture of relatively good living that 17th century afforded. You have the belief that we, the nobility, are capable of construing a state structures that are good for all of us. In fact, Polish nobility boasted of having more rights than Western European nobility, and that was true. Because in Western Europe, at that time already you had absolute rulers, whereas in Poland you had elected kings. They were elected by the nobility, not imposed by, say, the right of succession. And life is just great. And you help others insofar as you can. You don't harm others. Poetry of Kochanowski is a great example of Sarmatism. And the life is good. And let's see, what is this Browning poem which says, all is right with the world. This is also very typical of Sarmatism. All is right with the world. We have our life. We are free. Nobody can order us anything. We work hard. And this is what we want to be forever. And we are not looking around and plotting against our neighbors, and we hope our neighbors are not plotting against us, which turned out to be completely wrong. And also you can say that this is a very naive kind of Weltanschauung, because this is not the way people operate. And you also could say that, there was this large group of peasants. And there's this debate in Poland how badly off those peasants were, whether they really so oppressed, as some communist writers tell us, or were they really, living relatively quietly and well. And I cannot answer that question, but I've read this and I've read that, and I'm not sure. So this kind of attitude towards life was very characteristic of those people in Poland who were counted as part of history, because as we know, peasants don't have a history. That's of course not quite true, but in most of remembered history, it is the elites, it's the nobility that we are talking about, starting with ancient Greece through the Middle Ages and so forth. So the same in the Polish nobility took it for granted that, peasants don't count, that our life is what we create, our social class is the one that is supposed to be there and always right with the world. So this was the way they looked at things.
Speaking of that kind of naivete, in particular about what's coming eventually from the East, in with the Muscovites. Recently with some American conservatives, almost I don't want to say looking at Putin as somehow giving a historical account that perhaps may be accurate. But you've written a book on Russian imperialism, particularly from a literary point of view, and I think many people, at least in America, at least there's kind of a growing opinion that perhaps maybe Russia is not just an imperial power. It doesn't have imperial ambitions. It could actually be just like the West. So, do you have any comment on that? Because there's just more. I'm meeting more and more American conservatives who kind of see Russia as, in some ways, the hope for the West.
I'm aware of that, and I'm so sorry about that, and I don't know how to counteract that. This is, of course, completely and totally wrong. First of all, I think that in order to be a conservative, you have to understand what freedom and liberty are, because a conservative is a free man and woman also. And without liberty, without knowing that I can choose my religion, I can choose my way of living, there is no conservatism. Conservatism means that you want to preserve what's good in the past, and you want to pass it on to your children and to the next generation. In Russia, the idea that a person can make decisions by himself is simply unknown. That whoever is at the top, one person is always the one who decides. You have nothing to say. And if you are a slave this way, you cannot be a conservative. A slave cannot be a conservative, unless, of course, in a different sense, meaning, inside you can be free. But you cannot be a political conservative if you are a slave. And unfortunately, Russians do have this slave mentality, and not everybody, and not to such a degree, everybody, but it's there, because this is how Russian history has been constructed. Whatever they tell me at the top, they tell me here, I'm supposed to pass it on to people at the bottom. I do. And this is the way Russians look at the world. That's one thing. Second thing, somewhere in the Russian psyche, I can use such a term, which I don't like the term, because obviously, it's sort of, we're getting to too much things, that too many things we cannot really express in words. But somewhere in the Russian mentality, let's put it this way, is the idea of the Mongols. Press on, move on, keep going, destroy and take over this territory. Now, this is something that Russians have practiced just as Genghis Khan had practiced. He didn't know what he needed this land for, but he took it. Well, Russia has been enlarging its territory to the tune of 55 square miles per day for the entire 19th century. 55 square miles per day. Now, how many years in a century? And how many days in the year? Do you understand? Now, this is something totally absurd and totally unnoticed by the West, because most of the expansion was east. They took over the entire Siberia, which is killing a number of small tribes, by the way, completely wiping them out, but there's still some left. South, I mean, the first conquest of Russia was the Kazan and Astrakhan, two cities on the Volga River. And then quickly Russians composed a song which saying, Volga, Volga, Mать Родная, which means Volga, Volga, the Russian river, mother of rivers. Wrong. Volga was a Turkic river. It is a Turkic river, not a Russian river. So, Russians have this pressure, this something built into their psyche, this desire to take over. For what reason? Well, you become a great power. I suppose there's a good reason, but this is not conservative. This is not. It just totally alien, I think, to any reasonable conservative point of view. Conservatives want to preserve, want to stay where they are and not be taken over. The idea of a hobbit is a conservative idea, and the Russians are anything but hobbits. So this is completely wrong. And second thing, when you hear this version of history that Putin presented to Tucker Carlson, I actually listened to this entire thing. And of course, this is a version of history that's been taught by the communists in communist schools all since the communists took over. And I don't know about the 19th century. I have some samples of it, but I would not dare, to speak, to theorize. Karamzin's notion of Russian history was also pretty much the beginning of this, but we'll leave this historical stuff aside. Let's just look at communist Russia. Communist Russia was exactly telling the world the story that Putin told Tucker Carlson. And I'll tell you why it is wrong. Well, the facts are against it. When Putin was talking about Belarus and Ukraine as being reunited with Russia, well, they couldn't have been reunited because they were never united. Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania and parts of Latvia were part of the Polish-American Commonwealth, starting with the Jagiello marrying Jadwiga in 1384 until the last partition of Poland, 1795. So it's 4 centuries, right? 4 centuries, they were being part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. When did Ukraine become totally within the Russian grip? Well, with the last partition of Poland, 1795. And even then, part of Ukraine belonged to Austria, was given to Austria at that time. So there were parts of Ukraine that were never under Moscow's boot until after World War II. And these are facts of history. It's not opinions. It's a fact of history. So if it was you can say Poles were also colonialists because, they kept those people. They didn't treat Ukrainians well, and that's why Khmelnytsky rebelled. Agreed. But the point is that Khmelnytsky rebelled because he lived in this Polish tradition of liberty. I mean, they're oppressing me. I'm not going to allow that. I'm going to ask somebody for help. Little did he know that asking Moscow for help meant, that's the end of any freedoms he ever dreamt about. But the point is, that he asked Moscow for help in 1654. And for the first time, Russia gained some Ukrainian territory was in 1667 with the Andrusovo peace. Actually, it was just a temporary stoppage in the war. And for the first time, the left bank of the Dnieper River, including Kiev, fell into Russian hands. Okay, well, so, most of Ukraine was, as I said, in Polish hands until the partitions of Poland. So how could something be reunited when it was never united? I have no idea. And yet such nonsense is being sold by not just Putin, but by rather respectable historians in the United States, because they studied under people like Nicholas Ryazanovsky, a Russian historian who has been writing histories of Russia without even mentioning that there's another nation, Ukraine, that originated in Kiev, and not writing about partitions of Poland at all, as if they never happened. This idea of Russia that some American conservatives have is completely wrong and is based on Russian propaganda. That's all I can say.
Professor Thompson, let's end with this. When we think about Europe, there's this just this overwhelming secularism in places like Germany, Scandinavia, France, elsewhere, and then now, as we're describing, there's this sort of nihilistic pagan invasion from the East, I suppose, in a way. What though do you point to as kind of marks of hope when you think about, the future, the possible future of Christian civilization, the future flourishing of Europe and the West? What are the things that give you hope?
Well, you are a mark of hope, one of them. So that's something that should be remembered. I think, as somebody said, it was not the popes that initiated a renewal in the church. It was the non-clergy sometimes, or clergy, but of a new kind that started some kind of new order, or organized some kind of new way of proselytizing. I think that when it comes to Poland, I still think that there's a lot of deeply seated piety in the people. And as I said in this paper that I read in Rome, if I go to Poland, whether it's Warsaw or Krakow or even smaller towns, I always see somebody praying in the church, at 4 o'clock p.m., at 5 o'clock p.m., 1 o'clock p.m. Somebody goes there to pray. When I go to churches in Western Europe, I recall one situation when I was in Dresden, wanted to go to Mass on Sunday. So I went to the church, Catholic church, at 10 o'clock thinking, I'll get some kind of Mass, either beginning or end of the old one and the new one. There was not a soul there, not a soul. And I read there was an advertising there saying, there will be Mass here at 6 p.m. for the Polish workers who worked in Dresden, as laborers. I have to say I did go there because I couldn't. I had other things I was supposed to do. So you go to a Western European country and you don't see this, underground current of piety. If you go to Poland, you'll see it. And I just give you such examples, because I think they say something about the country, or what people treat as something normal. People who go to church not for the mass, but just to pray for a moment, tell you something about the country that you perhaps would not hear otherwise. People take it as a normal thing to just go to church to pray, just without going for a service or ceremony. I just want to be there for a few moments and meet Jesus in my prayers. And such things, strike me as a deep undercurrent of piety in Poland. When I go to Zakopane, which is my favorite resort in Poland, there's a little church there, and I used to go to mass there. And I once went too early, to half an hour too early. And what do I see? I see those old mountaineer women singing hours. And it was so beautiful. It was so impressive that, my husband and I just collapsed there, didn't go anywhere, waited, for another hour to get the mass. These are women that just come there on their own. They don't belong to any organization or anything. They just go there to sing hours. So, this sort of thing is visible in Poland, but not anywhere else. And I find, this may not be something that is impressive, but the country still has this foundation of normalcy, I think. So that's one thing. Second, there are quite a few Catholic initiatives in Poland that I think may bring fruit. The one that I'm sort of collaborating with, Theologia Polityczna, I'm sure you are familiar with that. This is something that the secularists would find very difficult to attack, because they tell the believers that they are primitive, that they believe in magic and things that are educated people should not be believing in. But you cannot say that about Theologia Polityczna, because this is a very intellectual kind of group of people. It's intellectual in the sense that it keeps up with world publications concerning the most important things, and that requires a certain amount of education and understanding to even approach. A person that has no philosophical background will find articles and books that Theologia publishes to be incomprehensible. So, those primitive anti-Catholic groups that exist in Poland cannot touch them, because there's no way that they can get under the skin of the organization, so to speak. So those things are there. There are a group of intellectuals that's still pretty strongly conservative. I have in mind people in Krakow, connected with Arcana, and Klub Jagielloński is sort of secular, but traditional in many ways. People like Legutko, people like Andrzej Nowak, Krzysztof Keller, Andrzej Waśko, these are people that are professors that are, of course, have doctorates and have published many books. And it's hard to sort of make such people into primitives that believe in some funny religion. And of course, there's a group of priests that's quite, I find, very well educated and writing good stuff. People like this Father Oko, who writes about homosexuality a great deal. Then there is the priest who is actually parish priest, but also a professor at the seminary. His name is Chyla, and I could mention other names. Father Sali just published a very good book on Catholicism, actually in English. What is our faith? It's almost like another catechism, except that it looks at things from It's not sort of impersonal. It's a more personal book. So, you know, there are centers that are quite resilient. The secularists in Poland do not just have to do with priests and the faithful that are very literate. They have a very serious opponents in various levels of Polish society. So I think there is hope there, and I still think that this new offensive, which is now beginning, I mean, even the crosses are being taken off the walls of state institutions. I think this offensive is going to fail, just as the communist offensive failed.
Well, that's encouraging to hear, and let's hope that Poland can continue to kind of lead the way intellectually and spiritually for the renewal of the West. Our guest today has been Professor Ewa Thompson. To all of you listening, if you like what you've heard, please do like this, share it, check out our website, spacealviinstitute.com. And for now, it just leaves us to thank you, Professor Thompson. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Having me.
Until next time, God bless and live in hope.